My name is Natasha Ellington, and for the longest time people believed I was living the dream. A big home, a successful family business, a husband I'd been with for years, and a teenage son who seemed to have everything a boy could want. If you asked anyone around us, they would have told you we were the perfect family. But let me tell you something right now. Appearances are nothing but illusions. And the illusion I was trapped in nearly cost me everything. I grew up under the shadow of a man I admired more than anyone. My father, Franklin Ward. He wasn't born into money. He built it, brick by brick, with sweat and grit. The Ward business empire didn't just carry his name. It carried his blood. People trusted him because he was honest, dependable, the kind of man whose handshake was worth more than a signed contract. When he passed, it wasn't just grief I felt. It was weight. And by my side, or at least that's what I thought, was my husband, Scott Ellington. To the world, Scott was polished, steady, a man you could rely on. I believed in him. I trusted him to help me protect my father's legacy and raise our son. Caleb was 15 at the time, tall, full of energy, a boy trying to figure out who he was going to be. I loved him with all my heart, and I tried to be the kind of mother who guided him without suffocating him. But while I was pouring myself into preserving my father's name and holding my family together, Scott was already moving in the shadows. He wasn't satisfied with me, with our home, or even with the life we had. He had a mistress, Selena Briggs. Younger, louder, and hungry for the place I occupied. She wanted my husband, my life, and the security that came with the Ellington name. And Scott, instead of shutting that door, entertained her, promised her more than he ever promised me. It wasn't just the affair that broke me. It was the way Scott began to turn Caleb against me. He made little comments, sharp enough to sting but subtle enough to pass off as jokes. "Your mom doesn't understand," he'd say. Or, "She's too hard on you, son." I get it, I really do. And little by little, my boy, my Caleb, started to look at me differently. He started pulling away, siding with Scott even in the smallest things, until I could feel the distance stretching wider every single day. But here's something I wish someone had told me back then. It's not always strangers who destroy you. Sometimes it's the people who sleep under your roof, eat at your table and call you family. And when it comes, it doesn't knock politely. Tears straight through your life. But before I go further, I want you to drop just one thing in the comments right now. Your favorite emoji. Nothing more, nothing less. The night Selena Briggs was found dead in my home still burns in my memory like fire. I can see it, smell it, feel the air heavy with something I couldn't name at the time. People always ask me what it feels like when your life is destroyed in a single night. I can tell you it's not like the movies. There's no dramatic music, no warning. It's confusion. It's silence so loud you can barely breathe. When I walked into that room and saw her lifeless body, I froze. Selena, the woman who had been haunting my marriage, now laying dead under my roof. My first thought wasn't rage. It was disbelief. What was she even doing there? But before I could process anything, Scott stepped into action. Not as a husband, not as a man broken by shock, but as someone who had a plan. He didn't panic. He didn't shout for help. He started moving things around, wiping surfaces, staging a scene like he had rehearsed it 1,000 times. I stood there, stunned, my heart racing. I didn't understand what was happening until I saw him pull Caleb aside. "Help me," he told our son. And Caleb, 15 and scared, obeyed. Scott handed him objects, told him where to place them, told him to wipe them down. I wanted to scream to stop it, but I was paralyzed by the realization that my husband was building a story that ended with me as the villain. He coached Caleb in that moment. He told him, "If anyone asks, you heard your mother and Selena arguing. You saw her upset. And my boy nodded. He didn't even question it. That's when I felt the crack in my chest turn into a shatter. Caleb wasn't just being manipulated. He believed his father. And in that belief, he was willing to paint me guilty. By the time the police arrived, Scott had already put on the performance of his life. Tears in his eyes, voice breaking as he told them how I had snapped, how I couldn't handle Selena in my house. He played the grieving husband, the protective father. And there I was, confused, shaking, trying to defend myself, but sounding exactly like what he wanted me to sound like. Unstable, hysterical, guilty. Then Caleb spoke. My son. He repeated Scott's lies word for word. He told them he had heard me yelling, that he saw me pacing angrily. He said he thought I might hurt Selena. Hearing those words from his mouth was worse than the cuffs clicking around my wrists. Because in that moment, I realized it wasn't just Scott against me. My own child had joined him. Neighbors gathered outside as the flashing red and blue lights painted the night. I was marched out of my own home, wrists bound, head spinning. People I'd smiled at for years, people who knew me as Franklin Ward's daughter, watched in horror as I was shoved into the back of a patrol car like a criminal. I tried to speak, tried to say I didn't do it, that I had no reason to, that they were making a mistake. But no one listened. Why would they? The scene had been staged. The evidence was against me. And the final nail in my coffin was the testimony of my husband and my son. As the car pulled away, I looked back at my house, the house that was supposed to be my safe place. Inside those walls, my marriage had rotted, my son had turned, and my life had just been stolen. I didn't know it then, but that night wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of a nightmare that would stretch for years. When my trial began, I told myself the truth would come out. I clung to that hope like a drowning woman clings to a piece of wood in open water. I thought if I just spoke, if I just told the truth, someone would see through the lies. But I learned quickly that courtrooms don't always run on truth. They run on stories. And Scott had crafted his story perfectly. He sat there in the courtroom, dressed in black, eyes red as if he hadn't slept in days. He held himself like a broken man who had lost everything. When he spoke about Selena Briggs, his voice cracked, his hands trembled. He called her a friend, someone who just wanted peace. He painted himself as a husband caught between two women, powerless to stop what he called my jealous rage. The jury hung on his every word. Then came Caleb, my son, my baby, 15 years old, sitting in that witness chair, looking smaller than I'd ever seen him, but speaking words that felt like bullets piercing me one by one. I heard my mom yelling at Selena. I saw her pacing. She was angry. He didn't cry. He didn't hesitate. He spoke with certainty, just the way Scott had trained him. And with every word, I felt the jury turning colder, further away from me. When it was my turn to speak, I poured out my soul. I told them I hadn't killed anyone, that I had walked into that room as shocked as anyone, that Scott had manipulated the scene, that my son was being coached. My voice broke, my hands shook, but I spoke my truth. And yet I could see it in their eyes. They didn't believe me. To them, I was the angry wife, the jealous woman who couldn't stand another woman in her home. The prosecution only made it easier, building their case brick by brick around the narrative that Scott had laid out for them. Every piece of evidence they showed, staged and planted, pointed straight at me. My fingerprints on things Scott had placed. My supposed motive, gift-wrapped by his affair. My own son's testimony, sealing the coffin. It didn't matter how many times I said, I didn't do it. In that courtroom, my words carried no weight. The day the verdict came down, I remember my body going numb. Guilty of second-degree murder. The words echoed, and I felt my knees weaken. I wanted to scream, to fall to the ground, but I couldn't. My pride wouldn't let me. I just stood there, silent tears running down my face, as the judge sentenced me to years in prison for something I didn't do. I turned once, just once, to look at Scott and Caleb. Scott had the faintest shadow of a smile hidden beneath his mask of grief. And Caleb, he wouldn't even meet my eyes. My son, the boy I had carried, raised, loved more than anything, sat there as if I no longer existed. That was the moment I realized I had lost more than my freedom. I had lost him. As the guards led me away, the reality sank in. God had won. He had taken my son, my reputation, and my freedom in one brutal stroke. Outside that courtroom, people whispered, "That's her. That's the woman who killed her husband's mistress." And I couldn't defend myself. Not anymore. The sentence had spoken for me. From behind bars, I would replay that trial in my mind over and over. The lies, the betrayal, the faces of the jury who believed every word but mine. That trial wasn't just about convicting me of murder. It was about burying me alive while Scott consolidated everything. My home, my son, and the empire my father built. And Caleb, he didn't just reject me. He erased me. Prison strips you bare. Takes away your name, your dignity, your freedom. You're reduced to a number, a uniform, a body moving through concrete halls. But for me, the hardest part wasn't the cell, the cold nights, or the endless noise. The hardest part was the silence between me and my son. From the very first day behind those bars, I started writing letters to Caleb. My handwriting shook at first, the ink blotched from tears I couldn't hold back, but I wrote anyway. Every word was a plea, a cry for him to believe me. I told him over and over, "I did not kill Selena. Your father set me up. Please, Caleb, open your eyes. One day you'll understand the truth." I begged him not to let Scott poison him further. I reminded him of who I was before all of this. His mother, the one who carried him, fed him, prayed for him, fought for him. I poured everything into those letters. My innocence, my love, my desperation. But I never got a reply. Not a single one. Months went by, then years, and still I wrote. Birthdays, holidays, random Tuesdays. Every chance I got, I sent him a piece of me, hoping that one day something would break through. Sometimes I would imagine him opening one, reading it late at night, maybe hiding it from Scott. That fantasy kept me going. But reality was crueler. The few times Caleb came to visit, it was like sitting across from a stranger. He'd sit stiff in the plastic chair, eyes cold, repeating the same lines Scott had fed him. "Mom, you need to stop lying. You did this. Dad told me everything." His voice carried disdain, disgust even. I'd reach for his hand, and he'd pull back like my touch was poison. Those visits, instead of giving me hope, tore pieces out of me I didn't think I could lose. Still, I never stopped writing. Even when my hands cramped from hours of scribbling, even when my tears blurred the ink. Each letter was a lifeline, not just for him but for me. It was how I kept my humanity intact in a place designed to crush it. I refused to let Scott's version of me be the only one Caleb ever knew. Prison is a lonely place, but it teaches you who you are. And I learned that I was stronger than the bars around me. Every ignored letter, every cold visit, every harsh word from my son hardened something inside me. Not into bitterness, into determination. If I couldn't reach Caleb now, then one day I would. If the truth wasn't enough today, then one day it would be. I watched women around me give up. Stop writing, stop hoping, stop caring. But I couldn't. Because as much as Caleb had turned from me, he was still my son. And as much as Scott thought he had destroyed me, I knew the truth. I carried it like a burning coal in my chest, waiting for the day I could place it in their hands and watch them flinch. They had stolen my freedom, my family, my reputation. But they could not steal my will. I was Natasha Ellington. And even in a cell I wasn't finished. Not yet. Prison teaches you how powerless you are. The world outside keeps moving without you. And no matter how much you scream, write or pray, you can't stop what's happening beyond those walls. I learned that the hardest way when I got the news that my father, Franklin Ward, had passed away. I wasn't there to hold his hand. I wasn't there to hear his last words. I wasn't even allowed to stand at his graveside. My father, the man who built everything I was trying to protect, was gone, and I sat in a cell while strangers carried his casket. That grief, that helplessness, nearly broke me. But what came after was worse. Franklin had built an empire, not just for himself, but for me, his only daughter. His business, his properties, his name. They were supposed to be my inheritance, my future, the legacy I would pass to Caleb one day. But while I was behind bars, Scott stepped in. He used my absence like an open door, and Caleb, already under his spell, walked through it with him. I later learned how it all happened. Scott forged papers, twisted signatures, manipulated legal documents until he gained control over my father's empire. And Caleb, still young but eager to please, went right along with it, letting his father convince him that what they were doing was for the family. They moved in quickly, like vultures circling fresh prey. One of the first things they did was sell one of my homes. A home my father had bought me years ago, a home filled with memories. Just like that. The money didn't go to preserving the business or keeping things afloat. No, Scott used it to chase risky ventures, funneling funds into shady deals and backroom trades. He wasn't content to keep the Ward legacy alive. He wanted to flip it, twist it, milk it for everything he could get, even if it meant gambling it all away. And Caleb. My heart still aches when I think of how easily he followed. He was no longer the boy I raised. He was Scott's shadow, learning his schemes, copying his arrogance. He spoke my father's name with pride, but not with respect. The Ward name had become nothing but a tool to them, a brand to hide their crimes behind. I could feel it corroding even from inside prison. Letters from old family friends told me things didn't look right. Clients were uneasy. Rumors of dishonesty started spreading. The company that had once stood as a beacon of trust under Franklin Ward was beginning to rot. And I was helpless to stop it. I'd lie awake on that thin prison mattress, fists clenched, teeth grinding, wishing I could kick the walls down and put an end to what Scott and Caleb were doing. But all I could do was endure, waiting, hoping, believing that one day the truth would surface. That was the hardest part of my sentence. Not the cell. Not the guards. Not even the stares of women who sized you up every day. The hardest part was watching my father's legacy be stolen and destroyed, piece by piece, by the two people who should have been protecting it with me. They thought I was gone for good. They thought prison had erased me, that Franklin's empire was theirs to pillage forever. What they didn't know, what they could never understand, was that my father didn't just leave me a company. He left me strength. And while they were tearing his legacy apart, I was quietly gathering the will to take it back. 12 years. That's how long I spent behind bars for a crime I didn't commit. 12 years of waking up to the clanging of metal doors instead of the sound of birds outside my window. 12 years of meals served on plastic trays, of being searched like an animal, of carrying the label murderer when I knew I was innocent. When the day finally came for me to step out, I thought freedom would feel like breathing fresh air after being underwater too long. But it didn't. Felt strange. Unfamiliar. The world had moved on without me. When I walked out of those gates, there was no one waiting. No son with open arms. No husband to hold me. Just silence. I carried my small box of belongings and took my first steps into a life that no longer felt like mine. Caleb was a man now. Grown, hardened. And Scott. He was still Scott, still the master manipulator, still carrying that same look of contempt I had seen in his eyes when the verdict was read all those years ago. The first time I saw Caleb after my release, it nearly broke me. I looked at him, searching for the little boy I had raised, the child I had written hundreds of letters to. But he didn't meet me with warmth. His eyes were cold, distant, like I was a stranger. He hugged me, if you could call it that, stiff and polite, more for appearances than love. My heart ached, but I told myself I couldn't give up. He was still my son, no matter how far Scott had turned him against me. Scott, on the other hand, didn't even pretend. He made his contempt clear. His words were sharp, his smirk mocking. To him, I was a ghost from the past, someone he had already buried. He didn't expect me to fight back. He didn't expect me to still have strength left after everything he'd done. And yet, despite the coldness, despite the pain, I chose forgiveness. I told myself I couldn't spend the rest of my life clinging to anger. I wanted to rebuild. I wanted my family back. Against every instinct in me, I allowed Scott and Caleb to remain in positions within Franklin Ward's company, the empire they had been mishandling all those years. It wasn't weakness. It was hope. Hope that if I gave them another chance, we could mend what prison and betrayal had torn apart. I remember sitting at the long boardroom table, the same one my father had once presided over, with Scott on one side and Caleb on the other. My father's portrait hung on the wall behind me, his eyes watching as if he knew the battle I was fighting inside. I spoke softly, carefully, telling them I wanted to move forward, to build something again as a family. They didn't respond with joy. Scott's eyes narrowed, suspicious, mocking. Caleb sat stiff, arms folded, like he didn't trust me. But I stayed calm. I offered forgiveness they hadn't asked for. I extended a hand they didn't deserve. Not because they had earned it, but because I couldn't allow myself to drown in bitterness. Walking out of prison after 12 years, I thought the fight was over. I thought forgiving them might heal us. I was wrong. I didn't know then that the real storm was still ahead. Thanksgiving was supposed to be a moment of peace, a chance to sit around the table as a family and pretend, just for one night, that everything was okay. I cooked, I set the table, I tried to make the atmosphere warm, even though I could feel the tension humming underneath. I had been out of prison for only a short while, and I thought maybe this holiday could be the bridge back to my son's heart. I wanted to believe that food and tradition could heal what years of lies and separation had torn apart. We sat at the table, plates full, the smell of turkey and sweet potatoes filling the air. Scott sat across from me, his fork scraping deliberately against his plate, every sound reminding me of his contempt. Caleb, now grown, sat beside him, carrying himself with the swagger of a man who thought he knew the world, but I could see it in his eyes. The recklessness, the arrogance, the shadows of choices that could only end in ruin. I spoke gently. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I simply said, "Caleb, be careful with the company you keep. Not everyone who calls themselves your friend has your best interests at heart." It was advice, nothing more. A mother's plea. But it struck something in him, something raw, something ugly. His chair screeched back against the floor as he stood. And before I could even process what was happening, his hand cracked across my face. The sound echoed through the dining room. I felt the sting, the heat rising in my cheek. Then came the spit, sharp and cold against my skin. "I hate you, woman," he shouted. Not mom. Not mother. Woman. Like I was nothing. Like I was a stranger. The room went silent. The only sound was my heart, pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I looked at him. My son, the baby I had once held against my chest, the boy I had written letters to for 12 years straight, and I didn't recognize him. His face was twisted with rage, his eyes wild, and behind him sat Scott, smirking. That smirk. He didn't have to say a word. His expression told me everything. He had won. He had turned my son into a weapon, and now he was using him to break me in public. But I didn't break. I didn't scream. I didn't retaliate. I lifted my head, wiped my cheek, and I smiled, faint but steady. And in that moment, I whispered a prayer that would change everything. "Lord, fight for me." It wasn't anger I felt. It wasn't even humiliation. It was surrender. For years I had carried the weight of proving my innocence, the burden of trying to win back my son's heart, the pain of holding together the shreds of my father's legacy. But in that moment, with my cheek burning and spit drying on my skin, I gave it up. I handed it over. Not to Scott, not to Caleb, but to the one who sees all things, even the lies hidden in shadows. What none of them knew, not Scott with his smirk, not Caleb with his fury, was that my prayer would be the seed of their undoing. That Thanksgiving table, meant for gratitude, became the place where their downfall began. 2 days after that Thanksgiving table turned into my place of humiliation, something happened that I can only describe as divine timing. While I was still nursing the sting of my son's slap and the echo of his words, "I hate you, woman," an old wound was quietly being cut open again. Selena Briggs' murder. The case that had stolen 12 years of my life. I didn't know it at the time, but an investigator had begun re-examining the files. Cold cases, they call them, the kind everyone forgets about after the ink dries on the conviction. But this time someone looked closer. They noticed things that had been ignored. Forensic evidence that was once brushed aside suddenly mattered again. A timeline that never quite lined up. Fingerprints that didn't belong where they were found. Piece by piece, the lies Scott had built started to unravel. The investigators began interviewing people who had testified all those years ago. Old neighbors, friends, people who had seen Scott and Selena together but were too afraid or too overlooked to speak up fully at the time. Details that had seemed minor before now painted a clearer picture. One where I wasn't the jealous wife who snapped, but the woman set up to take the fall. And then came the most painful discovery. Caleb, my son. They dug into his statements, his testimony, the way he had described things during the trial. And inconsistencies began to show. How could a 15-year-old know certain details unless he had been in the room that night? Why did his story match Scott's so perfectly, almost word for word? They started connecting dots I had known in my heart for years. Caleb hadn't just been manipulated into testifying against me. He had been a participant. A teenage accomplice helping his father stage a scene that destroyed my life. Hearing that truth was like being torn in two. On one hand, I felt vindication. For 12 years, I had screamed that I was innocent. For 12 years, I begged someone to look deeper. And finally, someone was. But on the other hand, it meant my son, my own flesh and blood, had stood beside Scott that night and helped bury me alive. Not by mistake. Not by accident. But by choice. The investigators didn't tell me everything at once. At first, all I heard was that my case was being re-evaluated. But even that small phrase lit something inside me. For the first time in over a decade, I felt the ground shift. I felt hope crawl its way back into my chest. Scott had smirked at Thanksgiving, so sure of his power, so certain he had beaten me. Caleb had spat in my face, convinced I was the enemy. But neither of them knew that, while they reveled in my humiliation, the truth was clawing its way back into the light. 12 years ago, I walked out of my home in handcuffs, stunned and broken. Now, for the first time, I could see the possibility that I might walk into a courtroom again, not as the accused, but as the woman who was wronged. While investigators were quietly reopening the case that had stolen 12 years of my life, another storm was brewing, one that would tear through what Scott and Caleb thought they had secured forever. My father's company. Franklin Ward's legacy. For years I had worried, even from my prison cell, that Scott was bleeding the business dry. I'd heard whispers from old friends and associates who wrote to me, warning me that things weren't the same. Now those whispers turned into alarms. Clients began pulling back, questioning contracts that didn't add up. Suppliers who had trusted the Ward name for decades started demanding answers. And then the paper trail surfaced. Documents showed money missing from accounts, embezzlement, fraudulent contracts with fake signatures, assets moved in and out of shell companies Scott had set up, all under the banner of Franklin Ward's name. It was greed in its purest form, and it was sloppy. Scott believed he was untouchable. He thought no one would ever dare to question him because, for years, everyone had assumed I was the criminal and he was the grieving husband who had picked up the pieces. But when you dig deep enough, arrogance always leaves fingerprints. Federal investigators began to circle. What started as quiet questions turned into full-blown investigations. Subpoenas were issued. Counts were frozen. Business partners started cutting ties overnight. What my father had spent a lifetime building with honesty and sweat was now collapsing under the weight of Scott's lies. And Caleb, he was right there in the middle of it. No longer the teenage boy parroting his father's words, but a grown man who had learned to mirror Scott's arrogance and corruption. He signed off on deals he barely understood. He funneled money the same way his father did. He bragged about profits that weren't real. And when clients began questioning him, his confidence slipped into desperation. I heard through whispers that their demeanor had changed. The same men who once strutted around with their heads high were now snapping at staff, pacing through hallways, shouting into phones. They tried to patch holes in a sinking ship, but the leaks were too many. Every move they made to cover their tracks only led authorities deeper into the rot. I wasn't surprised. Not even a little. Because you can build a house of lies, and it might stand tall for a season, but eventually the cracks will show. And once they show, there's no stopping the collapse. For me, watching from the outside, it was surreal. For so long, I had carried the weight of being labeled a murderer, a fraud, a disgrace to my father's name. Now the truth was fighting its way to the surface, not just in the case against me, but in the empire Scott and Caleb had twisted. The company that had been my father's pride was in flames, but instead of sorrow, I felt a strange sense of justice. They had used Franklin Ward's name to cover their greed. They had mocked my years of pain by parading around as men of power. Now the very name they exploited was the one burning them alive. I didn't lift a finger. I didn't have to. All I did was wait. And as the walls closed in on Scott and Caleb, I finally began to see what my father had taught me all along. Truth doesn't need your help to shine. It will always burn through the dark on its own. For 12 years I had been powerless. I had been silenced, mocked, stripped of my freedom, and robbed of my father's legacy. But when the cracks began to show in Scott and Caleb's empire, I knew it was time. No more letters begging to be believed. No more waiting for justice to stumble its way to me. This time I was going to fight. The first step I took was hiring a lawyer. not just any lawyer but one who understood how to wage war in two arenas at once. I needed someone who could clear my name in Selena Briggs' murder, and at the same time tear through the lies Scott had wrapped around Franklin Ward's empire. I remember sitting in that office, my hands trembling slightly, as I laid everything out. The wrongful conviction, the fraud, the forged signatures, the stolen properties. My lawyer leaned back listening, then said the words I'd been waiting 12 years to hear. "We can win this." And so we began. The team dove headfirst into the mountain of paperwork Scott had left behind. Contracts with my father's company that carried signatures I never signed. Property sales that had gone through while I was behind bars, funneled into accounts hidden under false names. Bank statements that led to shell companies, all designed to bleed Franklin Ward's business dry while Scott and Caleb lined their own pockets. Every document they unearthed was another weapon in my hands. It was surreal to see in black and white how thoroughly I had been erased. My name scratched out, replaced by forged initials. My authority stolen with the stroke of a pen. But with each discovery, my anger turned into strength. This wasn't just about money. This was about reclaiming the dignity they had stolen from me. At the same time, the cold case investigation into Selena's death was running parallel. Forensic inconsistencies, Caleb's teenage involvement, Scott's motive. All of it was finally being pieced together in a way that made sense. For years, they had lived like kings while I carried the title of murderer. Now the evidence was pulling me back into the light. I filed lawsuits to reverse property sales. I challenged fraudulent contracts in court. My legal team subpoenaed records Scott thought he had buried forever. And with each victory, no matter how small, I felt myself rising again. Scott's arrogance began to crack. I could see it in his eyes during hearings, the way his jaw tightened when my lawyer presented evidence he couldn't refute. Caleb, once confident and dismissive, started shrinking in those courtrooms. He wasn't the boy who had spat on me at Thanksgiving anymore. He was a man watching his lies unravel, thread by thread, in front of judges and lawyers who weren't buying the story his father had fed him. I didn't shout in those courtrooms. I didn't gloat. I sat silently, hands folded, watching the truth do what it had always been destined to do: break free. For the first time in over a decade, I felt the power shift. I wasn't the accused anymore. I wasn't the woman begging to be believed. I was Natasha Ellington, Franklin Ward's daughter, and I was taking back what was mine. Every forged signature uncovered, every hidden account exposed, every fraudulent sale reversed. It wasn't just a win on paper. It was a step toward rewriting my story. Scott and Caleb had built their empire on lies, and now I was dismantling it brick by brick, in full view of the law. For years they thought they had buried me. But the truth was, they had only given me time to sharpen my resolve. And now I was striking back with everything I had. The investigators came to me first. They told me things I had been screaming for years, but hearing it confirmed out loud almost broke me all over again. Selena hadn't just been in my home that night because of some casual visit. She had confronted Scott. She was tired of being hidden, tired of waiting. She had threatened to expose everything: the affair, the lies, the double life he was living. And Scott, cornered and furious, silenced her. He killed her. I should have felt relief hearing those words. Finally, the truth. But what came next cut deeper than any prison sentence ever could. Scott hadn't been alone. Caleb, my son, 15 years old, my baby, he was there. He wasn't just a witness. He helped. He moved things. He wiped surfaces. He stood shoulder to shoulder with his father as they staged the scene that would later condemn me. All those years I told myself Caleb had been manipulated, that he had spoken against me because Scott poisoned his mind. But the investigators showed me evidence that he hadn't just testified out of confusion. He had knowingly lied. He had been coached, yes, but he had chosen to protect his father, even if it meant sending his mother to prison for 12 years. When they confronted him as an adult, he broke. The weight of the lies, the mounting evidence, the questions he couldn't wiggle out of anymore. It crushed him. Piece by piece, his story unraveled. He admitted he had been there. He admitted Scott told him what to say. He admitted he had carried the lie from his teenage years all the way into manhood, never once looking back, never once standing up for me. Do you know what it feels like to hear that your own child helped bury you alive? To sit there as investigators confirm what your heart has always whispered but your soul refused to believe. It's like being stabbed in the same wound over and over. I had survived prison, humiliation, and betrayal, but this was different. This was my son. I thought back to the countless letters I had written. The visits where he sat across from me with disgust in his eyes. Every time I had begged him to believe me. He knew the truth. He knew I hadn't killed anyone. But still he chose Scott. He chose lies. He chose betrayal. The disturbing reality was finally out in the open. I hadn't been imprisoned because of a mistake. I hadn't been locked away because the system simply failed me.
Well,
I was wrongfully convicted because the two people I should have been able to trust above all others, my husband and my son, chose to protect each other and destroy me. Sitting in that room as investigators laid it all out, I felt my chest tighten. Not from shock, not even from pain, but from clarity. The illusion of family I had clung to for so long was gone. The truth had burned it to ashes. And yet, even in that moment I knew something else too. Scott and Caleb thought their lies would keep me down forever. But now their lies were about to be the very reason they lost everything. I'll never forget the day they finally came for Scott Ellington. For years, I had replayed the image of myself being marched out of my home in handcuffs, neighbors whispering, the shame burning into my skin. Now it was his turn. The knock on his door wasn't gentle. Federal agents filled the space he once ruled like a king. They read him his rights as they cuffed him, not for one crime but for all of them. Murder, fraud, conspiracy. Every sin he thought he had hidden was dragged into the light. I wasn't there in person, but when I saw the footage later, I noticed something I'll never forget. He didn't cry. He didn't plead. He smirked, just like he had at Thanksgiving, as though even in chains he believed he could talk his way out of it. That smirk would be the last mask he ever wore. Then came Caleb, my son. The boy who had once been 15 when he helped Scott cover up Selena's death, now a grown man following in his father's footsteps. He was charged as an adult, not just for his role in staging that scene all those years ago, but for the fraud and corruption he willingly dove into as Scott's partner in crime. Embezzlement, document forgery, misuse of company funds. All of it fell on his shoulders, and this time, there was no one left to shield him. The community that once pitted Scott, that once shook their heads at me as the jealous wife who snapped, now saw the truth. They watched as the Ellington men's empire collapsed in full view. Neighbors who had once whispered about me being a murderer now whispered about how they could have been fooled for so long by Scott's performance. Former business partners who had once trusted my father's name recoiled as the lies were laid bare. The empire they had tried to steal was crumbling under the weight of their arrogance. And me. I didn't gloat. I didn't scream in triumph. I remained poised. I pressed forward with determination step by step. Because arrests weren't enough. I needed to clear my name officially. I needed to reclaim Franklin Ward's empire fully. And I needed the world to know that justice, though delayed, had not been denied. For 12 years, I was the one in chains while Scott and Caleb lived free. Now the tables had turned. And as I watched their downfall unfold, I carried a quiet strength inside me, not born from revenge but from survival. They had stolen my freedom, my family, my legacy. But now all of it was coming back piece by piece. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of their reckoning. Walking back into a courtroom after 12 years felt like stepping into the same nightmare all over again. Only this time the roles had shifted. I was no longer the accused. I was no longer the woman on trial for something I didn't do. I was the one finally being vindicated. When the judge read the motion to overturn my conviction, I felt tears sting my eyes. For so long I had carried that label, murderer. For so long I had been reduced to whispers, stares, and shame. Now, piece by piece, that burden was being lifted. The court acknowledged what I had screamed for over a decade. I was innocent. Selena Briggs had not died at my hands. I had been wrongfully convicted, and today, justice was finally being spoken out loud. But the true reckoning wasn't just about me. It was about them, Scott and Caleb. The prosecutors laid everything bare. The affair. Selena's threats. Scott's rage. Caleb's teenage role in staging the scene. The forged testimony. And the years of fraud that followed. Document after document, witness after witness, forensic expert after forensic expert. All of it pulled the mask off the Ellington men. Scott sat there in his suit, but there was no performance this time. No grieving husband act. No tears. Just a hollow shell of a man who knew his lies had finally caught up with him. When the sentence came down, life imprisonment, he didn't even flinch. Maybe he thought he'd die before ever serving the full term. Maybe he believed the world owed him a pass. But the gavel came down, and his fate was sealed. Then there was Caleb, my son. Watching him in that courtroom was harder than hearing my own sentence years ago. He tried to minimize his role, claiming he was only a scared teenager, manipulated by his father. He wanted to erase the weight of what he had done. But the truth was undeniable. He hadn't just been a boy caught in something beyond him. He had been a man who continued those crimes into adulthood. Fraud, forgery, embezzlement, cover-ups. His past and present crimes stood side by side, and the jury saw them clearly. When the judge handed down his sentence, a lengthy prison term, I didn't cheer. I didn't cry. I just sat silently, my hands folded, listening. This wasn't the kind of victory you celebrate. This was justice. Cold, heavy, and absolute. I had dreamed of this moment for years. The day the truth would finally rise. The day my name would be cleared. The day the people who destroyed me would face consequences. And yet, sitting there, I felt no triumph. Only release. Only the quiet peace of knowing I hadn't lost my mind all those years insisting I was innocent. The world finally saw what I had always known. I wasn't the murderer. I was the mother, the wife, the daughter who had been betrayed and buried alive by the people closest to her. And now, as I listened to the sound of the gavel striking wood, I knew one thing for certain. My vindication was complete. When the courts cleared my name and the gavel came down on Scott and Caleb, there was still work to do. Vindication was one thing, but restoration was another. I had lost 12 years of my life, 12 years of my father's legacy, 12 years of the empire Franklin Ward built with his own hands. Now it was time to take back what had been stolen. Piece by piece, I began reclaiming it all. The homes that had been sold under forged papers returned. The properties they had tried to funnel into shell companies, placed back under my name. Every fraudulent deal they had used my inheritance to secure was unwound, no matter how long it took. My lawyer and I pored over stacks of documents until every shred of what belonged to me was rightfully restored. I walked back into my father's company not as the broken woman who had been paraded into prison 12 years ago, but as his daughter, carrying his name, his strength, and his vision. The Ward name had been tarnished under Scott and Caleb's hands, but I refused to let it die in their corruption. I re-established the company's integrity. I cut ties with anyone who had enabled their schemes. I built safeguards, protections, and oversight so that no one, not a husband, not a son, not anyone, could ever use my inheritance as a weapon against me again. I didn't rush to celebrate. There were no grand parties, no champagne toasts. My victory wasn't loud, it wasn't showy. It was quiet, intentional, steady. I walked through my reclaimed home slowly, touching walls that had once echoed with betrayal, now mine again. I sat at my father's boardroom table, not to boast, but to remind myself that his blood built this, and his daughter had saved it. People expected me to gloat, to take joy in Scott and Caleb's downfall. But that wasn't what this was about. My victory wasn't in watching them fall. My victory was in standing tall again, in reclaiming every piece of myself they tried to erase. Everything taken from me. My freedom, my reputation, my inheritance was returned. Not because I screamed, not because I fought with fists, but because I endured long enough for the truth to break free. Franklin Ward's legacy was safe again, and so was mine. When I think back now, it's almost surreal. Scott Ellington, once so smug, so confident in his ability to manipulate everyone, sits in a prison cell with nothing left to his name but shame. My son, Caleb, who once believed protecting his father's lies would keep him safe, now carries a prison sentence of his own. His arrogance stripped away along with his freedom. The men who destroyed me ended up destroying themselves. And me. I didn't lift a hand against them. I didn't plot their downfall in secret. I didn't scream for revenge. All I did was survive long enough for the truth to surface. Time, truth, and the law did the work that my fists and anger never could. Sometimes I think back to that Thanksgiving table. The sting of Caleb's hand against my face, the spit sliding down my cheek, the words that cut deeper than any blade. I hate you, woman. For a long time, that moment lived in my chest like a wound that would never close. But now I see it for what it was, the trigger. The very humiliation they tried to use to break me became the spark that set their destruction in motion. That night I didn't fight back. I didn't curse or scream. I simply smiled, faint but steady, and whispered a prayer. Lord, fight for me. And he did. Not through fire or thunder, but through truth. Through patience. Through justice. My revenge was never loud. It wasn't about shouting from rooftops or parading their downfall. It was silent. It was absolute. It was watching the walls they built from lies crumble down on top of them while I stood free, whole, and restored. Scott and Caleb thought they had buried me. They thought they had erased my name, stolen my legacy, and silenced me forever. But here I stand. Natasha Ellington, daughter of Franklin Ward. Survivor. Restored. Vindicated. My story isn't about vengeance. It's about justice. Justice that came slowly, painfully, but completely. Justice that turned humiliation into redemption. Justice that answered a simple prayer whispered at a Thanksgiving table. Lord, fight for me. And in the end he did.